Thank you both for your talks. I was going to ask you a few questions, mostly hoping to get you in conversation with each other and then open this to the broader public for questions. Sander, so you amusingly also pointed out many continuities of how Holocaust remembrance or the Holocaust or the comparison of people you don't like to Nazis has existed and in fact for at least the last 30 years or longer in various contexts. What has actually changed then in the last few years in the way that perhaps Susan's introduction described it in Germany, but also Valentina's talk?
Well, the theme, if I had a theme, was that each moment believes that it is overwhelmed by the past. And that's driven by access to fragments of the past, some real, some invented. So what I hear over and over again in the social media, Twitter, Facebook, is that we have now this overwhelming access to, and I'll put it in quotation marks, facts, right? So what is changed is the moment of excess. But that moment of excess has always existed. It existed with Gutenberg, right? I mean, it's nothing new, except we always think of it as new. And what struck me about this set of conversations is that it seems to make the present moment somehow or another unique, which is part of the definition of the now. Our now is always unique, right? We never saw anything like that. And because we are now constituted in this moment, we know what's coming. It's predictive. And that's the question that I wanted to raise, which is, you elegantly and quite correctly began by asking the question of who owns the memories of the survivors. I will remind you in 1974 about the Auschwitz, Frankfurt Auschwitz trial, right? This was a trial of kind of camp guards. It's the scum that was left, basically, in West Germany. Not all of the scum, by the way, just some of the scum that was left. These people were as guilty as hell. Say that in advance, right? There's no question about their guilt. But they had to be defended. They had to be defended. So there was a defense attorney. Peter Hux makes a good deal of this in Die Ermittlung. And he asked every one of the survivors who bore testimony in the trial one question. One question. How many chimneys were there in Auschwitz? And each of them gave different numbers. Which is why, by the way, in the Deborah Lipstadt trial, they avoided putting the Holocaust on trial, but put the historian on trial. So I think that the question really we have to ask today is not so much is this something new, but how is it functioning now? And it is functioning absolutely on the right, but it is also functioning on the left. Noam Chomsky is a hero of mine. I hate to say that in public. Noam Chomsky has been a swine about what's going on in Ukraine today, okay? He has bought into every possible Russian bits of propaganda. So what's different? The difference is we're here, and we think it's different because we're here. Is it predictive of where we're going? No. History is lousy in accounting for the past. It sucks about talking about the present, and only political scientists talk about the future.
So, yes, which part? I'll start with the part where you were actually referring, who owns the survivors' memories? Well, obviously, each one of us owns their own memory. Then what happens? What happens is that as soon as the figure of the survivor becomes, and by the way, I was talking about victims, but I have the feeling that it's not so much a question of emphasizing the role of the victim nowadays, but what we're actually looking for is the survivor figure. Yeah, and this is another shift that's been taking place of late. So actually what's happened, let me just introduce this small digression, is that whereas for the first part of that process that brought from the Eichmann trial onwards, the world to be more aware of what had happened to the survivors of the camps and the victims too, the question that people wanted to find an answer for was, what did they do to you? And so the idea, the basic fundamental idea was that victimization was not to be a source of shame, not even of pride, as some said, but certainly not shame, because there was the role of society was to help people to regain faith in humanity. And so the question was, what did they do to you? And then what happened later on was that the victim role became, for some strange, paradoxical reason, desirable for those who weren't really victims because of the advantages, rhetorical advantages that it offered. But I have the feeling that in the last few years, there has been an ulterior shift from the victim figure to the survivor figure. So the question now isn't so much what did they do to you, but how did you manage to get through this? How did you survive that? And hence the idea of, survivors being models, exemplary models of, that we should look up to find an example of how to manage to get through the difficulties and hardships of life and the virtue of resilience and whatnot, which is another twist, because if you think about it, it introduces an idea of social Darwinism, which the idea of the survival of the fittest, which definitely the survivors who wrote in the 70s and even 80s, such as Primo Levi, would have never accepted as something, that was even, mentionable at all. So, who owns them? The problem is that people, the guardians of memory, feel that they can use and identify with those, and ask people to identify with those witnesses, and feel the same way, which is impossible, by the way, but all this insistence on empathy and the idea of prosthetic memories, and you can feel the same way as people who survived the catastrophe, which is all absolute. But why? Because whoever holds the power to speak for the victims can use this this symbolic heritage, patrimony. All these words have to do with private property, have you noticed? Heritage, patrimony, values, and whatever. And use it to turn it into something that will serve some present cause, whatever that may be. And it can be all sorts of causes. And I think this has happened over the last few decades. It wasn't always like that. I think the public memory of an event has its cycles. And my criticism is aimed at the latest cycle, that which happened since the 1990s. So that was one part of the answer. And as far as what has changed now, I do agree with you that the big difference, apart from all the political aspects that we mentioned, obviously the internet did do a lot to change things, because there is a point where quantity turns into quality, and that, I think, has enhanced many of these mechanisms in a way that was unforeseeable, completely unforeseeable.
So do you agree that, this sort of authoritarian potential, but also tendencies that Valentina teases out in the memory politics of the last 30 years, I guess it is, since the 90s?
Again, choose your case. Choose your case. You want to choose Putin? Agree completely. You want to choose Larry Kramer? I was on Larry Kramer's side, right? I was on Larry Kramer's side because I saw my friends dying of AIDS, right? I saw Ronald Reagan indeed as equivalent to Hitler, okay? I was completely comfortable with Larry calling Anthony Fauci out as a facilitator, as Eichmann, right? Now, of course, you look back and you say with horror, how could he have done that? But I'll tell you, it was effective. We all, come on now, those of us of a certain age all had act up buttons. And it was only, by the way, when I worked seriously on the Holocaust and on the camps that I realized that the guy who did the poster, of course, got the triangle upside down, right? That's the problem of memory. It's almost there, but never quite there. So, you know, the answer is, yeah, of course, I'm extraordinarily upset with the right wing, with the AfD, co-opting a kind of philo-Semitism. By the way, I've never met a philo-Semite I liked. Get along better with some anti-Semites than I do with philo-Semites. At least I know where they stand. But it, for me, is a really important question today because, you know, in the little blurb, which nobody read about what I was going to talk about, because if you read the blurb, you wouldn't have come, I said we had a very weird moment in Charlottesville in 2017, right? We had this right-wing march with tiki torches, which you used to keep the bugs off, across Mr. Jefferson's campus, the University of Virginia, right? And they were crying out, the Jews will not replace us. And their big mantra is, the Holocaust doesn't exist and it didn't kill enough Jews.
Yeah.
And I spent a lot of trying to figure that out. Right? And what I realized was trying to figure them out is a waste of time. What you want to ask is, and Ricoeur is right about this, what is the ethical position that they are advocating? Not what is the rhetorical structure by which we are trying to hear that advocacy.
The equivalent in Italy, they had marches in which they were wearing the Star of David, the anti-vax. They were wearing the star, but they were also doing the fascist, on the same. Yeah. Yes, and I agree with this, but there is, I think, a thornier issue that is implicit in what you're saying, and that is, okay, say somebody, you have to do with somebody who is saying things that you totally hate, and this is happening again in Italy a lot. It happened with the anti-vax, and both with the conspiracy anti-vax movement, and also with people who were just very, very critical with the government's policies concerning COVID. And they were all put together in one big category in the mainstream media, that is most media, and they were all labeled as negationists with the same word. And so what does it mean? That means that even when you disagree, and all the more so when you're not quite sure whether you completely disagree with these people, they are out of the picture. Yeah. You can't discuss with them. And that is, I think, one of the things I was talking about. It is a way of just making sure that a part of the debate, even the most horrendous part, if you want, is criminalized.
Or is made so abhorrent that if you stand in that position, and I said, I have been dealing with anti-vaxxers well before COVID. I've been working on epidemics since the 1980s, and certainly the first essays I wrote on anti-vaxxing was in the early 90s, right? One of the things you want to start to understand is what is the motivation. Then anti-vaxxing gets picked up within a symbolic vocabulary of the far right wing, right? By the way, really interestingly, not just in the kind of global, what we used to call the first world, right? But also in remarkable ways, also in places where one doesn't think that the internet infiltrates. It does, but doesn't. One of the questions then is, indeed, how can one engage those people who you want to interact with? Not the ones who are using this as a cudgel, but with whom you want to interact. And that becomes a real problem when you're simply saying you are all sort of evil and destructive, which of course is, and here I want to make the circle, why anti-Semitism has come back with incredible violence, and I use the word correctly, right, with physical violence on the right wing, right? Because what the right wing realizes now that it can use anti-racism, anti-Semitism as a means of furthering white nationalism. And that's true, by the way, in complicated ways in the Ukraine, in Russia, in the United States, certainly in the UK, and with the AfD here in Germany. It's that moment that one wants to get into, where speech acts become something which easily are converted into action, right? That's the moment. And when you drive people into that corner, that becomes easier.
I'm going to ask one last question, and then I'll open for conversation, discussion.
Yeah.
So, do you have any ideas for how we can counter the way that Holocaust remembrance is instrumentalized for illiberal or xenophobic or anti-Semitic projects? Sorry, it's unfair. But
It's the question that always, I find the most difficult one because in a way, when people say, well, what would you do then? I say, I wouldn't do these things. I mean, there are other things that you can do. And first of all, you have to ask yourself, because when people ask this question, they take it for granted that there has to be Holocaust remembrance on the same level as there has been so far, and that therefore they ask, how would you do it? First thing to do is, why are you doing it? Mm-hmm. So what are you doing it for? Because if you're just doing it because you feel that it's, and I agree, it's not something we should forget about, then history is more than enough. I mean, you don't have to have all the commemorative rhetoric. But obviously, if we have all this rhetoric and the politics of memory, is because people feel that it's instrumental to some other goals. Apparently, it's supposed to be to fight racism and in all its forms, not just anti-Semitism and whatever. So ask yourself, is what I'm doing regarding Holocaust commemoration useful to that purpose? Because if it's not working, then what you've done so far is not reaching that aim. So think about it. Be less automatic about these rituals. Try to think about what you're doing, because ideally you ought to promote critical thinking through that example or other examples. It doesn't necessarily have to be that example, but promote critical. Whereas what's happening now, it's stifling critical. It's used to stifle critical thinking, because the moment somebody mentions the Holocaust, those who don't have the right to speak on behalf of the victims just have to shut up. They have nothing, and they're afraid to get it wrong, so they just don't say anything, and they comply and they follow the rituals, and that is exactly the opposite if the objective really were to fight racism.
All memorialization is a form of forgetting, not of remembering. My wife and I lived in Hamburg in the 70s, and every day from our apartment I would walk past the great botanic garden, Planten und Blumen, to my office at the university. And I would walk past a huge memorial. I and tens of thousands of people every day walk past this huge memorial. I asked somebody one day at the university, what was the memorial for? And he said to me, there's a memorial in front of Planten und Blumen? So the next time I walked by, I read the dedication. It was a dedication to the dead of the Prussian-Danish War. So the next day I said to my colleague, a historian, it's a monument to the Prussian-Danish War. And he looked at me and he said, Germany fought Denmark? Who won?
Thank you. Okay, open to questions. I think we don't have a microphone stand, which is what we do. We have a microphone stand. You can line up at the microphone stand if you would like to say something. I cannot see for the life of me.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentations and this talk. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the instrumentalization of the narrative around the Holocaust at this moment where there's also such a stark rejection of other efforts to teach critical history, obviously in the US and in Western Europe, termed as critical race theory. And I wondered if you could maybe talk us through how some of the frameworks that you were describing, in particular Dr. Pisanti, about how those narratives were formed in the context of European post-war nation building, and maybe how it was a bit of a circumscribed Holocaust narrative that stayed within a historical context that was pretty bookended, right, by that specific moment of the war, rather than these broader narratives that critical race theory fosters about bigger histories that persist. So, it's maybe more of a premise rather than a question.
It's a huge question. It would require a few hours to answer. But anyway, I think, to make it very, very brief, which is not really fair to do, there are some dates that really are watershed dates in this process of memory building, referring to the Holocaust, and that is when the Holocaust gradually became the one and only narrative just about that was supposed to unite all of the Western world. And I think that a lot of it came from the United States. I mean, the first phases came from Israel with the Eichmann trial, United States, so 61 Eichmann trial, 78 the mini-series Holocaust, which had an amazing impact both in the States and certainly in Germany, but also in the rest of Europe, and changed the perception and drove that narrative to the heart of European as well as American consciousness, which in the case of Europe could have been reasonable enough, but in the case of the United States it was kind of strange to see how that event that didn't even take place on American soil was to structure the conscience of all Americans, despite all the other things that they could have structured their obviously the reason was that the role that the Americans had vis-a-vis that narrative was a little less, to be ashamed of than other stories that they could have told. And then the 90s and the fall of the Berlin Wall. I think these are the three big watershed dates, and something changed in each of these dates. So if you want, we can talk about it later. But the thing is, it became, the Holocaust narrative became a screen narrative that was, in many cases, used to sideline, push away from people's consciousness events that the countries where this memory was established were more directly implied, and not in the role of victims, but in the role, if you want to use these terms, of bystanders or even perpetrators, or all that gray area in between. And very often the Holocaust narrative was useful to kind of shove away under the carpet other more sensitive issues for the various countries, and possibly this is a part of the answer to the question that you were posing. The other way to use it is, as we said, by appropriating its categories. So it's either a screen memory in many cases, or an appropriation, where you use the empty narrative form and you put yourself in the role of the victim, yourself or your group, and you use that same narrative format, which is very, very specific, because the absolute perpetrator and the absolute victim, you don't often find it in history. Very often what happens is that things are a bit messier than that, and possibly even regarding the Second World War up to a point. So sorry, it wasn't a complete answer, but we can talk about it later if you want.
Hi, can you hear me? Sorry, I'm a bit short for the microphone. Thank you both, that was really fascinating. I have a question about witness testimony and the use of witness testimony, particularly in contexts where stories or histories are deliberately suppressed. So for example, in Israel, where the destruction and erasure of Palestinian existence and therefore empirical evidence, such as with Palestinian villages, has been integral to a nation-building project. Witness testimonies of Palestinians who used to live in these villages is integral to remembrance and commemoration, and also evidence of life there. But in turn, this has also been used as evidence to discredit them, because they only have witness testimonies to prove their existence, and so that isn't reliable evidence. So I guess my question is, how do we use witness testimony in those contexts where there is not wider empirical evidence either available or it's deliberately suppressed by the state or other organizations? Thanks.
That's beyond my competence.
Well, perhaps it's beyond my competence too, I think, but I have, one point I was trying to make was that there is an ideal place of our, the mind or social activities where this kind of confrontation can take place, and that is the scientific method, which is something that people talk about, and we very well know that historians are not all neutral. They don't always, follow this ideal of a totally ideologically free area where people don't. But anyway, they need to. And I'm not just talking about historians. I'm talking about an argumentative way of thinking that follows the rules of the game. And so that is why I think it is terrible if that way of thinking, the possibility of putting one testimony against another and trying to understand as objectively as you possibly can what's a lie and what isn't, and having these independent places where this can happen, which in a democracy should not just be the history department. It should be the whole of society where people can ideally freely discuss things. And yes, that is why I feel that freedom of research and expression is just not a value that you can give up in the name of other democratic values. I feel that all the others depend on that. So basically what I'm trying to say is that all this authoritarian drift is making it impossible to answer your question, because whether there's a state or in subtler forms, a kind of moral pressure not to bring up certain things because otherwise you're worried about how people might react and what they might call you. Well, all this makes it impossible to decide if there's anything true, perhaps, in both accounts, even if they're conflicting, or if somebody's completely inventing something. But anyway, you don't have a way of finding out, because you only have one authority that from up above will tell you what you have to believe in. And I think this is the beginning of the end if you start thinking that way. And if people accept that it's normal, it's the end.
Well, I mean, again, without going to the specific case, because the specific case is one of the reasons, obviously, as Susan said, this conference has both been created but also has been used as a kind of cudgel to be people who want to have the ability to critically analyze and discuss complicated political questions, right? Why is it that BDS becomes part of a regimen now of the far right? I will point out to you, because I love this analogy, that it was, of course, the CDU and the CSU, with support from the other parties, that brought that resolution into the Bundestag. But you may not know that the legislature of the state of Texas, which meets every 2 years for approximately 30 days, also passed an almost identical condemnation, stating that any person who has a contract with the state of Texas has to swear, has to make out a statement to swear that they will not in any way support BDS. Now, I do not want to bring an analogy between the state of Texas and Germany, but my God, you can do it in that case, right? The question is, what, in point of fact, are you trying to undertake? That in Texas, this was linked, last question, to the forbidding of the teaching of critical race theory, was noted only by nasty little people like me, right? So the answer is, why do we do this? Because we may be wrong as historians, but we're able to admit over time that we're wrong. By the way, I exempt myself from that statement.
Thank you so much, both of you. I am part of a crew of people who I think are very much aligned with you, Dr. Gilman, with the tiny little nasty, I can't even remember what you said, I was laughing too hard to remember all of it. But the way that that anti-BDS legislation has then been translated in Texas, for example, into legislation that shuts down any kind of boycott or divestment of oil companies and needing to make a pledge of that very same thing. And the way that that then is shutting down climate justice organizing. And my question is really, I'm curious to hear from both of you your thoughts about that context that is happening, particularly in the US, which is where I'm organizing, but also internationally, and its relationship to the incredibly fast spread of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which is very specific about criticism of Israel, and is unlike any definition we have for other forms of oppression, and therefore really separates anti-Semitism from the greater movement for liberation, justice, et cetera. And just the chilling effect that that's having on policy for racial equity, racial justice. I'm particularly following in the US, but I'm very curious what either one of you has to say about that kind of suite of issues. Thank you.
Well, let me just say, I'm a signer of the Jerusalem statement, so I'm prejudiced to start with, right? A group of historians attempted to create a working definition of anti-Semitism to answer the British definition, which quickly became a global definition, right? And I think, again, this has to do with how the Holocaust has become, in very complicated ways, a free-floating signifier that can be fit into any symbolic system. And it has become now a kind of go-to system for the far right and is compatible with the far right's anti-Semitism. And again, you may think that's contradictory. It isn't, because symbolic regimens don't have to be logical. They're effective, they're emotional, right? They're not aimed at making people think, they're aimed at making people feel. That's a really important distinction. And one of the things that has happened certainly in historiography over the last decade, has been now examining the history of emotions, right? How do we think about emotions as one of the factors when we think about the writing of history? So yeah, I mean, you're quite right that Texas manages to bundle it in a very specific way. And the far right manages to bundle it in a very specific way. Do we give it to them? I hope not, because that's what critical thinking is about.
I too signed the Jerusalem Declaration, and I tend to agree with your last answer, and also the criticism. But I feel it's really a bit disturbing, this insistence on emotions and as a form of alternative knowledge of facts. The idea of feeling like as if you were there, as I said earlier on, I think it's the best way to make people stop thinking and also stop thinking about the alternatives, because what happens when you're feeling strong emotions, or you think you're feeling strong emotions by proxy, is that you start seeing events in a very unilateral way, and it seems like there's only one way for events to occur, and you just are blinded to the possibility that each step of an event, each of the chain of events, could have gone differently, and that is how you learn from history, if there's anything to learn from history. This anti-Brechtian strategy that is being used through the media, through mainstream media, the idea that you have to feel as if you were there, feel empathy, and it's something that has been one of the characteristics of the last few decades, again, since the 90s, think about the way in which the mirror neuron research has been exploited to justify just about everything and say, it explains ethics and aesthetics and whatever. Everything is explained. Altruism. Everything is explained as if it were natural. Our natural tendency to empathize, which is something which is fairly debatable. And anyway, you can't bring it about just through some technique. And even if you could put yourself totally in somebody else's shoes, how does that make you a better person? And how does that make you more capable of tackling the problems and trying to solve them and seeing the alternative solutions to some situations that might look like there is no solution, there is no alternative, there is no other way of thinking about things? And yes, so I agree with you.
Thank you both so much. I think we have a break before the film screening of the film by Nico Appel and Daniel Cohn-Bendit, We Are All German Jews, and there will be a Q&A after that. So there's a break now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.